The Boy Who Fell in Love with His Reflection. A Tale Between Worlds. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting somewhere a little different. Not to the damp castles or freezing fjords we usually haunt, but to a quieter, more reflective place. Somewhere between myth and memory. Between the mountains of China and the forests of ancient Greece. So, if you've settled in, lights low. Maybe the world's a little too loud today. This one's for you. We're going to talk about two stories, separated by oceans and centuries, but bound by the same strange thread. The story of the boy who fell in love with his own reflection. You've probably heard the Western version, the Greek myth of Narcissus, that beautiful young man who stared into a pool of water and fell hopelessly in love with himself. But what's less known is that the Chinese have their own quiet echo of this tale, not as a moral about vanity, but as something softer, sadder, and perhaps more human. So tonight, we'll drift between these two stories, one bathed in Mediterranean sunlight, the other in mist and moonlight, to see how two very different worlds found the same truth, that loving your own reflection can be as tragic as it is inevitable. Sisyphus. The Greek reflection. Let's start where Western philosophy loves to start, with a handsome young man and a terrible idea. Narcissus, according to Ovid, was born from beauty and prophecy. His mother, the nymph Liriope, was told by the seer Tiresias that her son would live a long life, as long as he never knew himself, which, if you think about it, is a deeply unhelpful riddle. But in Greek myths, "don't do this one thing" is usually code for "please go ahead and do it spectacularly." Narcissus grew up to be beautiful. Not just regular handsome, but distractingly, ruinously so. The kind of beauty that ruins other people's afternoons. Poets followed him. Nymphs adored him. Shepherds forgot to count their sheep. And of course, Narcissus wanted none of it. He wasn't cruel exactly, just uninterested. Every declaration of love he brushed off with mild annoyance, like someone swatting a fly. He didn't need others' affection because he had something far more intoxicating, himself. Now, it's easy to roll your eyes at him, or imagine him as a mythological influencer. But there's something quietly tragic in it too. He wasn't arrogant so much as hollow. He looked at other people and saw noise. And then, one day, he saw silence. The mirror in the water. He was wandering through the woods, tired from rejecting people when he came upon a pool, still, perfect, clear as glass. And there, in that water, he saw someone beautiful, someone whose gaze met his perfectly, whose lips parted in time with his own. You know what happens next. He fell in love. Hard, fast, hopelessly. He tried to speak, but the water only answered in ripples. He leaned closer, and the reflection came closer. He smiled, and the image smiled back. It was the perfect relationship, until he realized it wasn't real. In some versions, he wasted away there, unable to leave, transfixed by what he could never touch. In others, he leaned too close, and the water swallowed him whole. But in all of them, a flower grew where he died. pale petals bending toward the water's edge, as if still trying to see itself. That was the birth of the narcissus flower, which still grows near quiet ponds and riverbanks, always looking down. It's an image that's lasted for over 2,000 years. A boy in love with his reflection, and maybe because it feels so modern, so human. We all want to know ourselves, but we also want to like what we find. And that's where things get tricky. The Chinese reflection, the tale of the mirror boy. Now let's drift east, across mountains and centuries, to another reflection. In an old Chinese folk tale, less well known but hauntingly similar, there was once a young man who grew up in a small village nestled beside a deep, still pond. He was quiet, thoughtful, and solitary. He spent most days watching the water, not out of vanity, but because it was the only thing that ever seemed to listen. One morning, as the mist rolled low over the water, he saw something beneath the surface, not his reflection. Not exactly. Something softer. A boy who looked like him, but somehow gentler, kinder, more serene. And when he leaned close, the other boy smiled. At first, he thought it was a trick of light, but as days passed, the boy in the water began to move differently. When he frowned, the reflection stayed calm. When he turned away, it waited for him. It began to feel alive. He came to the pond every morning. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, just to see that face again. And soon, the villagers began to worry. They told him it was bad luck, that the water spirits were playing with him. They begged him to stop, but he couldn't, because when he looked into the pond, he didn't see danger, he saw peace. One day, when winter came and the pond began to freeze, he knelt by the ice, desperate to see his friend again. He brushed away the frost and pressed his hand to the surface, and when it cracked, he fell through. The villagers pulled him from the water, but he didn't wake, and when they looked down, the ice had sealed over again. Inside, faintly, they saw two faces, one still, one smiling, forever frozen together. They say that in spring, when the ice melts, that pond still glows faintly at dawn. And if you look long enough, you might see yourself, not as you are, but as you wish to be. The shared reflection. Now, it's tempting to think of these stories as opposites. The Western one about arrogance, the Eastern one about longing. But really, they meet in the same place, at the edge of knowing yourself too well. The Greeks made Narcissus a warning. Love yourself too much, and you'll drown in it. The Chinese story makes it an elegy. Seek yourself too deeply, and you might lose what was real. Different tones, same quiet truth. That sometimes the reflection we fall for isn't vanity, it's yearning, the wish to find something perfect in an imperfect world. Reflections in time, across history, mirrors and reflections have always unnerved us. Before glass mirrors, people used water, polished bronze, or obsidian, all of which distort what they show. You never really saw yourself. You saw something that looked back, almost right, but not quite. And that uncertainty, that shimmer of unreality, became a kind of magic. In Europe, mirrors were thought to trap souls. In China, they warded off demons, because evil couldn't stand to see its own face. In both worlds, the reflection was never just an image. It was a doorway, sometimes to beauty, sometimes to ruin. The modern echo now. We live surrounded by reflections, in glass, in screens, in the eyes of strangers. Narcissus would have had a field day. But maybe we're all just as lost as he was. We scroll through faces, angles, filters, little digital pools, each reflecting a version of ourselves we half recognize. And just like the boy by the Chinese pond, we mistake that shimmer for connection, but the more we stare, the less we see. Still, there's a strange comfort in knowing this isn't new. People have always been drawn to their own image, not out of vanity, but curiosity, a desire to understand who we are and maybe why we're never quite enough, a soft ending. So tonight, maybe don't think of Narcissus as a warning, or the boy at the frozen pond as a tragedy. Think of them as two dreamers, separated by oceans, each searching for something only they could see. Maybe they weren't punished for loving their reflection. Maybe they were just the first to realize how fragile the line is between seeing yourself and disappearing into it. So as you drift off now, imagine that still pool of water, clear, calm, endless. You look down, you see yourself, not as the world sees you, not even as you imagine, but as something softer, a version that simply exists. No judgment, no fear, just reflection. And if you linger there long enough, don't worry, the world will wait for you to look away. Because of the charming inbreeding we discussed earlier, many royal children weren't just lonely. They were chronically ill. Hemophilia, epilepsy, facial deformities, and mysterious nervous ailments filled the royal medical records. Doctors of the era prescribed delightful treatments: bloodletting, mercury, and occasionally the power of prayer. Survival was considered divine favor. Death, divine mystery. Palace nurseries often smelled of incense and despair. Half hospital, half chapel. And in the corner, tutors rehearsed lessons for heirs who might not live to learn them. It's remarkable any of them reached adulthood, let alone ruled empires. The silver spoon, slightly poisoned, modern audiences love the idea of royal privilege. But for many of these children, privilege was just a decorative word for captivity. They were surrounded by servants, but had no friends. They had wealth, but no freedom. They were adored in public and ignored in private. And when they did grow up, they carried their childhoods like invisible armor, heavy, rigid, and impossible to remove. Some became paranoid tyrants. Some became withdrawn philosophers. A few tried to be normal, only to discover that normality isn't in the royal curriculum. Der Feed for V. Quiet night in the nursery. Let's end where we began, in the royal nursery. The candles have burned. Lo, the governess whispers a prayer. The Eat-Seat, small prince or princess, dressed in lace and duty, drifts to sleep under portraits of stern ancestors who are also, inconveniently, their cousins. Somewhere, A court musician plays a lullaby on a harpsichord. It sounds soothing, but it's slightly out of tune, like the entire system that produced it. The future monarch will sit straight, smile faintly, and try not to sneeze during theology. A fragrant beginning. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world that didn't smell quite like ours. A world of candle smoke and chamber pots, of wet wool, tallow, and, let's be honest, people. Because tonight we're talking about how people actually smelled in the Middle Ages. So, settle in, dim the lights. Take a slow breath through your nose. Enjoy the relative luxury of whatever your room currently smells like, and imagine yourself walking through a 14th century town. You pass a bakery. That's pleasant. Then a tannery. Less pleasant. A fishmonger. A horse stable. A man boiling something unidentifiable in a barrel. Congratulations! You're halfway to medieval Paris. The first thing to understand is that people didn't think they were dirty. We always picture medieval Europeans as proudly rolling around in filth, but in their own minds, they were doing just fine. They bathed occasionally, they washed their hands before eating, and they changed their linen shirts often enough to feel civilized. It's just that their definition of clean and ours have a difference of about 7 centuries and several public health revolutions between them. Let's start with bathing. In the early Middle Ages, say, around the 9th or 10th centuries, public bathhouses were common across much of Europe. They were Roman leftovers, cultural echoes of those glorious aqueduct-loving ancestors. But by the 14th century, most of them had either decayed, been repurposed into something depressing, or closed because the church had begun to eye them suspiciously. Bathhouses, you see, had developed a reputation for extracurricular activities. Theologians began to murmur that where there was warm water and nudity, there was probably sin, which, to be fair, was occasionally accurate. So, naturally, rather than addressing the moral issue directly, society simply declared washing to be morally ambiguous. Problem solved. So as you drift toward sleep, imagine them, the quiet sons and daughters of kings and queens, watching coronations from the edge of the crowd, wearing fine clothes that didn't quite fit, carrying family names they couldn't publicly claim. Still, many people did bathe at home, just not every day. A wealthy noble might bathe once a week, or on special occasions. Peasants, far less often. Bathing required hot water, which required firewood, which required time and energy that most people didn't have. So a full-body bath was a bit like modern people doing a deep spring clean. Admirable, but not a daily event. Instead, cleanliness came in layers. The most important layer wasn't skin, it was linen. People changed their underlinen frequently, sometimes daily if they could afford it. The logic was that clean linen would draw impurities out of the body, much like a medieval detox program. So you might not wash your torso for a week, but if your shirt was crisp and white, you could still consider yourself spotless. This leads to one of my favorite medieval misunderstandings. People genuinely believed that dirt sat inside the pores, and that water could actually drive it further inward, corrupting the flesh. So some thought frequent bathing could make you sick, which, ironically, was sometimes true, depending on what you were bathing in. And what did the world smell like exactly? Well, that depended on where you stood. If you were lucky enough to live near the countryside, things weren't too bad. Fresh hay, livestock, manure. The occasional smoky breeze from a hearth. Unpleasant, yes, but familiar. City life, on the other hand, was an olfactory adventure. Streets were narrow and often doubled as sewers. People threw waste out of windows with the sort of casual grace that comes from routine. Rain would wash it toward the nearest ditch, or into a river, or simply redistribute it evenly for everyone to share. Animals were everywhere. Pigs wandered freely because they were the medieval garbage disposal unit. Cows, goats, chickens, all contributing their notes to the local perfume. Add in open tanneries using urine to treat leather, and you have a scent that modern perfumers might describe as robust, earthy, and deeply traumatic. But perhaps the most constant source of smell was people themselves. Human odor was not considered offensive in the way we think of it today. It was simply part of the atmosphere. Everyone smelled human, therefore nobody noticed. Natural sense even had meaning. Medieval physicians, trained on the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, believed a person's odor revealed their internal balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A healthy smell was warm and moist. A sickly one, cold and dry. And somewhere between those, you could find the average European peasant, faintly scented of smoke, onion, and sheep. Perfume existed, of course, but it wasn't just for beauty, it was for health. People carried pomanders, little metal orbs filled with aromatic herbs and spices. They believed pleasant smells could literally drive away disease. In a way, they weren't entirely wrong. The herbs repelled fleas and masked rot, both of which could save you from the plague, or at least make it smell slightly nicer. Let's drift now into the noble world, because if anyone in medieval society tried to smell good, it was the upper class. Royalty had access to scented waters, rose oil, lavender sachets, and, crucially, servants to do the dirty work for them. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly bathed twice a year, an impressive schedule by local standards. Her contemporary, Louis XI of France, preferred to skip bathing altogether, convinced it weakened him. Instead, he changed his linen daily and surrounded himself with sweet-smelling herbs. So he probably smelled like an anxious baker trapped in a greenhouse. The English court of Henry VIII, however, was unusually enthusiastic about cleanliness, at least early on. Henry enjoyed scented baths and had entire rooms devoted to bathing rituals. Of course, by his later years, when he was covered in ulcers and resentment, the fragrance situation deteriorated. Palace chroniclers became tactfully silent on the matter, which tells you everything. For ordinary folk, cleanliness was more practical than perfumed. Women washed clothes and hair with lye soap. Harsh, stuff that could strip the color from fabric and dignity alike. Men might rinse their hands and faces in the morning, and perhaps feet before bed. That was considered polite. Hair was another story. Without shampoo, people relied on oils, vinegar rinses, or, failing that, head coverings. A good hat could hide a multitude of sins. Monks shaved their crowns not for fashion, but for hygiene and humility. And everyone, rich or poor, battled lice. Comb makers were highly respected craftsmen for good reason. If you wanted to smell acceptable, you'd sprinkle rosewater on your clothes or carry herbs like rosemary and mint in your pockets. Some women sewed small pouches of lavender into their gowns. An early, portable version of laundry detergent ads promising freshness that lasts. Public smells were part of daily navigation. People used their noses like maps. The fish market? Easy. Follow the scent of decay mixed with salt. The baker's shop? Heaven on earth. The blacksmith's forge? Hot iron and sweat. It was a world organized by smell long before street signs became common. And despite everything, people liked certain medieval scents. The combination of beeswax candles and wood smoke in a church was considered comforting. So was the smell of bread, ale, and horses. It's only our modern distance that makes us recoil. To them, these smells were the background, music of life. There's a persistent myth that medieval people had no sense of smell. That's nonsense. They were hyper-aware of it, probably more than we are. Odor was a form of information. They believed sickness had a scent. That virtue did too. Some saints were said to release a heavenly fragrance when they died. The odor of sanctity. A nice contrast to everyone else's general aroma of mortality. Even cities had reputations for smell. Venice was said to stink less than Paris, thanks to its sea breezes. London, famously, smelled of human industry, which is a very polite way of saying it reeked of everything people did and threw away. Chroniclers describe summer heat, thickening the air with vapors unwholesome to the lungs. You can almost feel it, dense, warm, faintly alive. So how did people survive it? They didn't think of it as surviving. They simply lived in it, their noses adjusted, like how someone living near a farm stops noticing the manure. After a week, it became the smell of home, and it's worth remembering. Medieval Europe was not uniquely disgusting. Other parts of the world were far cleaner. Islamic cities like Cordoba and Damascus had functioning public baths, drainage, and even proto-soap industries. Travelers from those regions were routinely horrified by European odor, which tells you something about cross-cultural humility. But for most Europeans, a faint whiff of humanity was just part of being alive. Water was dangerous. Perfume was medicine. And smelling strongly was, in its own way, proof of vigor. So, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that world, the hum of a busy street, the warm sweetness of bread mixing with the acrid smoke of tallow candles. A world before deodorant, before plumbing, before citrus-scented cleaning sprays promising mountain freshness. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. The air was heavy with life itself. And that's where we'll pause tonight. Next time, we'll drift deeper into the medieval bathing world. How nobles turned washing into ceremony, how monasteries kept hygiene alive, and why everyone suddenly stopped bathing during the Black Death. For now, just breathe gratefully through your nose. And remember, by medieval standards, you smell absolutely divine. The loneliest job in town tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. A world of crumbling stone walls, smoky taverns, and towns that always seem to smell faintly of damp wool and despair. But don't worry, you're safe, tucked in. And the only sharp object nearby is probably a phone charger. Because tonight, we're talking about a man who spent his days surrounded by blades. The executioner. Now, most people imagine him as a faceless figure in a black hood, swinging an axe while thunder rumbles overhead. But that's mostly Hollywood's doing. In real medieval life, the executioner wasn't some mysterious stranger. He was often your neighbor. A strange one, sure, but he lived just down the street, probably owned a dog, and definitely had an awkward reputation at the local market. You see, being an executioner wasn't a calling. It wasn't a dream job you grew up hoping for. It was more like a punishment with benefits. Let's start with a little context. In medieval Europe, the act of execution, of killing someone legally, wasn't just a grim necessity. It was theater. Public performance meant to remind everyone else to behave. And someone had to play the lead role. That someone was the executioner, officially called the Scharfrichter in Germany or the Bourreau in France. Titles that sound very grand, until you remember that their main duty involved removing heads from bodies with varying levels of efficiency. But here's the thing. Executions didn't happen all the time. A small town might go months or even years without anyone worthy of hanging or beheading. So what did the executioner do in between? Did he just sit around, sharpening his sword and waiting for crime to happen? Well, sort of, but also not really, because the medieval executioner was more than just a state-sanctioned killer. He was the town's unofficial problem solver, especially when those problems were too unpleasant for anyone else to touch. Let's drift to late 15th century Germany, where records are unusually thorough and morbidly detailed. In cities like Nuremberg or Augsburg, the executioner might have an official salary, free housing, and a few perks, like a garden and tax exemption. But socially, he was radioactive. People believed he was unclean, both spiritually and literally. It's hard to overstate how deep this social stigma ran. In 1910, executioner couldn't enter churches without causing scandal. He couldn't buy bread from most bakers, and good luck finding a wife who wasn't the daughter of another executioner or the town's resident outcast. So they lived on the fringes, literally. Their houses were usually outside the city walls, near the gallows or by the river, conveniently located for both decapitation and waste disposal. But that isolation didn't mean idleness. When there were no executions, the executioner became a sort of grim handyman, a municipal multitasker for all the city's dirtiest work. Need a pig slaughtered? Call the executioner. Found a suspicious corpse in the river? He'll handle it. Need to torture a prisoner for a confession? Amputate a criminal's hand? Or dispose of diseased livestock? All on his to-do list. In fact, many executioners became surprisingly skilled surgeons, though surgical hygiene was not exactly the era's strong point. Because if you're already used to cutting flesh and tying arteries, it's not a huge leap to medical practice. One of the most famous examples was Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s. He kept a diary of his work, detailed, calm, disturbingly matter-of-fact. He executed 394 people during his career, but he also treated over 15,000 patients. Coughs, boils, wounds, fractured bones. He handled them all. Imagine visiting your local healer, and halfway through, realizing his side gig involves hanging people on Thursdays. Medieval health care was varied, but Schmidt was unusual in that he had education and a sense of purpose. Most executioners didn't choose the profession. They inherited it, because once your father had the job, the stigma attached to the whole family. It was nearly impossible to leave the profession. So sons became executioners. Daughters married other executioners or criminals, a social circle of about 20 people that no one else wanted to shake hands with. In fact, cities often forced condemned men to take up the trade as an alternative to death. A criminal spared the noose might be told. Congratulations, you're now the hangman. And so, irony struck early. The man once sentenced to die would now be the one delivering death. This arrangement didn't always go smoothly. Many of these reluctant hangmen were drunk, incompetent, or simply traumatized. A botched execution was not only a public spectacle, it was bad for business. Imagine the town square full of angry citizens, the condemned screaming, and the executioner realizing he should have sharpened his axe yesterday. When business was slow, executioners often relied on other income streams. Some brewed beer, some practiced medicine. As mentioned, others became experts in animal slaughter or leather tanning, trades that also involved blood and knives. So they were, well, transferable skills. In some towns, they even ran brothels. It made sense. The brothel, like the gallows, was technically immoral, but legally necessary. And since both fell outside the polite world, they often shared management. One can imagine the awkward bookkeeping. One hanging, 3 treatments, and 2 extracurricular services. But while the work was varied, the reputation never changed. Children would cross the street to avoid them. Priests refused to bless their homes, and the townsfolk, despite depending on them for law and order, treated them like walking bad luck charms. It's easy to forget that in a medieval town, everyone knew everyone. So when the executioner appeared in public, people noticed. There are accounts of butchers refusing to sell him meat, even though his job wasn't that different. In some places, he had to wear special clothing to mark his status, usually black or red. Other times, people just knew him. Faces travel fast in a town of 2,000. And yet, paradoxically, he was sometimes respected, feared, but respected. If you needed someone to settle a dispute quietly, or to heal a festering wound, or to perform an unofficial service after dark, he was the man to call, the medieval equivalent of the guy who knows a guy. So between executions, he became the town's fixer of physical and moral messes, someone who did what everyone else refused to touch. And that made him both indispensable and untouchable. Let's drift over now to France, where the role was even more institutionalized. By the 14th century, the French crown appointed royal executioners, a kind of hereditary bureaucracy of death. The Sanson family, for example, would dominate the profession for centuries, eventually running Paris's guillotine during the Revolution. But in the medieval period, their work was still more artisanal custom orders, let's say. They handled everything from executions to public mutilations, floggings, and even street cleaning. Yes, street cleaning. Because when plague struck, someone had to remove bodies and waste. And since no one else volunteered, guess who got the job? So the executioner's work rhythm was oddly seasonal. Spring and summer might bring a few hangings or burnings. Winter could mean disease duty, sewage work, or pest disposal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And throughout it all, they kept their tools in immaculate condition. Axes and swords were expensive, and good steel was a badge of professionalism. Some even named their blades. It sounds dramatic, but when your career involves hundreds of decapitations, you form attachments. When night fell, though, life could get lonely. Executioners weren't welcome in taverns, their children were shunned at festivals, even the church, supposedly open to all souls, kept them at arm's length. In some towns, they had a reserved pew in the very back, next to the door, just in case anyone objected. And many did. Because it wasn't just that the executioner killed people, it was that he touched them. Criminals, corpses, and blood. In a world obsessed with spiritual purity, that kind of contact carried a permanent stain. There are accounts of priests refusing to give communion to an executioner unless he first washed his hands 7 times, which, considering the medieval water situation, was an act of devotion all by itself. Yet, despite the stigma, some executioners became minor celebrities. If they performed their duties cleanly and efficiently, crowds admired their skill. A single precise stroke was considered merciful and elegant. A messy, repeated hack brought shame. There were even fan favorites. In larger cities, word spread about who was the good hangman. People preferred to be executed by a professional, not a nervous amateur. It was the last bit of dignity you could hope for. Some condemned prisoners even tipped their executioner beforehand, just to ensure a swift death. It was, in its own way, a customer service transaction. The medieval version of 5 stars would die again. But when all was quiet, when no prisoners awaited judgment and no gallows were built in the square, that's when the executioner truly disappeared from public life. He'd retreat to his home, tend his garden, maybe distill herbs for medicine. Some took up reading, others drank heavily, and some wrote. Franz Schmidt's diary, for instance, reads like a strange meditation on mortality and bureaucracy. Every entry lists a name, a crime, a sentence, and a method. No embellishment, just the steady rhythm of duty. He once wrote, "I have executed 361 people with my own hand, but I have also healed many thousands." It's an odd legacy, to be both healer and killer, despised and essential. Who cleaned up after medieval battles? The silence after the trumpets. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, but not to the part you usually hear about, not the banners or the trumpets, or the thundering cavalry charges that poets loved to exaggerate. No, tonight we're heading into the quiet part, the part after the glory. After the screaming stops, after the dust settles, when the only thing left on the field is an awful, buzzing silence, and the smell of several thousand men who will never get up again. Because someone had to deal with all that. Someone had to bury the bodies. Someone had to strip the armor, gather the arrows, and somehow make the place usable again. And strangely enough, history, which remembers every duke and every horse, rarely remembers the people who cleaned up their mess. So, tonight, we'll drift gently through their world. The grave diggers, scavengers, peasants, monks, and opportunists who lived in the shadow of war, quite literally ankle-deep in what it left behind. It's not glamorous, it's not noble, but it is, in its own bleak way, profoundly human. The morning. After the Middle Ages, let's start with the morning after a battle, the part that poets always skipped. The sun comes up. The mist rolls off the field. And what's left looks less like heroism and more like a medieval landfill. A typical battle site wasn't a neat affair. There were thousands of bodies, human and animal, scattered across mud and trampled grass, broken spears, shields, limbs, torn banners, lost shoes, bits of horses, bits of people. And because this was the Middle Ages, sanitation wasn't exactly a department. If you left it all there, it didn't just look bad. It killed people. Rotting flesh spread disease, poisoned water, and made entire regions unlivable. So, someone had to clean it. Not the knights, of course. They had already gone home to write poems about themselves, not the generals either. They were busy negotiating who won, which was rarely obvious. That left everyone else. The locals. The unlucky volunteers. Most often, it was the local villagers who got the job, whether they wanted it or not. Medieval lords didn't ask for cleanup crews, they commanded them. If a battle took place near your land, congratulations. Your new task was to spend the next few weeks burying people you didn't know, often using your own tools, and sometimes your own hands. Peasants were ordered by local authorities, or more often by passing soldiers, to dig mass graves. They worked in small teams, sometimes with their faces wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar to block the smell. It didn't work, but it gave them something to do besides cry. The ground was rarely soft enough. The shovels were often borrowed from barns. The graves were shallow, because after a while, everyone stopped caring about depth. And if it rained, well, let's just say things came back up. The problem of armor and loot, of course. The bodies weren't just bodies. They were wearing things. Valuable things. Chainmail, swords, helmets, belts, rings, purses. All of it technically belonged to someone, and all of it was now lying unguarded. Which meant that before any burial could happen, there was an informal and very enthusiastic period of scavenging. After battles like Towton, 1461, the largest in England's Wars of the Roses, witnesses described the field as a market of the dead. Local peasants and traveling soldiers stripped corpses bare, taking armor, boots, and anything they could sell. Some even pulled teeth for the gold fillings. Others sliced off fingers to get rings. And no one thought this was strange. Looting the dead was practically a cleanup step. A grim, necessary recycling process. Even the church, which frowned on such behavior, quietly tolerated it. After all, someone had to fund the burials, and there was no better currency than a dead knight's boots. Mercenaries and the bone men in larger conflicts, like the 100 Years, war, cleanup became an industry of its own. Bands of former soldiers, known as routiers, often drifted from battlefield to battlefield, offering their services as body collectors, scavengers, and bone traders. Yes, bone traders, because long after the bodies were buried, the bones were worth money. Medieval Europe had a brisk market for bone ash, used in fertilizer, glue, and certain metalworking processes. By the 15th century, there were reports of entire groups who would dig up old battlefields years later, carting away the remains for profit. They were called the Bone Men. They didn't talk much about what they did, but they followed wars like vultures follow carcasses, and they made a living out of death in a way that feels deeply medieval. Practical, unflinching, and faintly terrifying. The church steps in. Eventually, of course, sooner or later, the church had to get involved. Officially, leaving bodies unburied was a sin, a denial of Christian dignity. The dead were supposed to rest in consecrated ground, not rot in a ditch. So, monks and friars sometimes took on the grim task of organizing mass burials. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, for example, monks from nearby abbeys were sent to collect the fallen. William the Conqueror even ordered a special burial mound for the Norman dead. Though, conveniently, not for the English, but monasteries couldn't handle everything. Many times they arrived too late, and the bodies had already become unmanageable, so they would bless the ground instead. A kind of spiritual shortcut. If you can't move the bodies into a holy place, you make the place holy where they are. It was the medieval version of good enough. The sound and smell of it all now, because you're trying to fall asleep, will keep this gentle. But still, it's worth mentioning what these cleanup efforts felt like. Imagine standing in a field where thousands of men had been cut open by iron weapons, and it's midsummer. The air is thick. The flies arrive first, then the dogs, then the ravens. Within a day or two, the bodies swell. Armor buckles. Faces lose shape. The smell, according to a 14th century chronicler, was like 10,000 opened graves. And yet, people still had to work there. They used vinegar-soaked rags to dull the odor. They burned herbs and incense nearby. Some even chewed cloves or mint to mask the taste that the air left in their mouths. It's a small, human detail, the need to do something to make the unbearable feel slightly more manageable. A very lucrative kind of horrible. If you could stomach it, though cleaning up could be profitable. After the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English soldiers were left with over 8,000 French corpses on their hands. The crown paid locals to dig pits and burn bodies, offering wages in bread, ale, and sometimes coin. It wasn't much, but it was work, and in a century full of famine and plague, horrible but paid was better than horrible and starving. A few enterprising peasants even made a living as armor brokers. They gathered the remains of chainmail and sold them back to blacksmiths for reforging. One chronicler described these men trudging through battlefields with carts and hooks, fishing the field as a sea of metal. A darkly poetic image, if you can ignore what they were hooking. What about the horses? A question few people ask. What happened to the horses? Medieval battles used a lot of them, hundreds, sometimes thousands, and they died just as messily as their riders. A dead horse was a logistical problem. You couldn't bury all of them, and you couldn't leave them to rot near farmland. So, they were often butchered, not for meat, though in desperate times that happened, but for leather, glue, and tallow. Horse bones were strong and useful. Hides could be dried and sold. Even the hooves could be boiled down for glue. So, yes, somewhere in a medieval village, someone's window frame or bookbinding probably contained a little bit of Agincourt. History is a circle, and not always a pleasant one. Commemoration and forgetting. After the physical cleanup came the symbolic one. The process of deciding which dead were worth remembering. The nobles, of course, were buried in chapels with engraved effigies and flowing Latin inscriptions. the ordinary soldiers were buried together, nameless. Sometimes they got a cairn or a wooden cross. Most often, they got nothing. Their graves were lost within a few seasons, plowed over and forgotten. Centuries later, when archaeologists dig them up, the bones are found tangled together. Men from both sides, buried in haste and anonymity. In that sense, medieval battlefields were the great equalizers. For all the talk of honor and lineage, everyone ended up in the same mud, stacked shoulder to shoulder, nameless under the same indifferent sky. A few who stayed behind, not everyone left the battlefield, though some soldiers, especially those too wounded to move, were left behind with the dead. And if they survived, they often joined the scavengers. It's a grim detail, but it happened often enough to become a type. The field dweller, or camp scavenger. These were men too broken to fight, who wandered from one battle site to the next, living off what others left behind. They stripped bodies, looted abandoned wagons, and sometimes helped bury corpses in exchange for food. They were ghosts in their own time. Not quite soldiers, not quite peasants, living between wars and graves. Chroniclers rarely mention them by name, but when they do, it's always with a strange mixture of disgust and pity. Because deep down, everyone knew that, in the wrong circumstances, that could be any of them. A handful of these cleanups were recorded in surprising detail. Who did it? How long it took? What they found, and what they wished they hadn't. The children who weren't supposed to exist. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back through the velvet curtains of royal bedrooms, the sort of places history books usually skip politely over. Candlelit chambers where kings whispered promises they rarely kept. Queens pretended not to hear. And somewhere, inevitably, a child was born who didn't quite belong. Because tonight, we're talking about royal bastards. The children who stood just outside the golden circle of legitimacy. Too royal to be ignored. Too inconvenient to be acknowledged. They were loved, hated, erased, rewarded, and occasionally used like decorative chess pieces in Europe's great dynastic games. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. And as we drift through the centuries, try to imagine the strange, half-shadowed lives of those who were royal, but not quite royal enough. Now, the word bastard is a harsh one. Even by medieval standards, it comes from the Old French bastard, meaning pack-saddle child, as in a baby conceived while traveling on a saddle, because of course it does. Nothing like a word that instantly tells you your origin story and your social ranking. But in royal courts, bastardy wasn't always a mark of shame. In fact, for much of European history, it was almost a badge of normalcy, because kings, especially medieval ones, had an unfortunate habit of believing fidelity was for other people. Their mistresses were often noblewomen, sometimes even married ones, and the resulting children were dealt with. How they were dealt with depended on the father's mood, the mother's rank, and how likely anyone was to make a fuss. Some were given titles, castles, and a place at court. Others were quietly shipped off to monasteries, or married to someone far away with a nice dowry and a stern reminder to never mention who their father was. And the queens? They were expected to smile politely and get on with it, which many of them did, though often while commissioning slightly passive-aggressive religious paintings about fidelity and sin. Let's start with a man who treated legitimacy like an optional accessory, King Henry III of England. Henry, who ruled from 1100 to 1135, was famous for two things: his terrifying efficiency as a ruler, and his equally impressive efficiency in fathering children. By the time he was done, he had at least 22 illegitimate offspring, possibly more, depending on how generous you're feeling with the accounting. That's nearly enough for a small medieval village. And, remarkably, he actually recognized most of them. He gave his sons land, arranged good marriages for his daughters, and treated them with a kind of pragmatic affection. They were his political tools, loyal, ambitious, and grateful, which is a rare combination in royal families. But, of course, all those children complicated things, because when Henry's only legitimate son, William, the heir, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, the throne suddenly looked very empty. Henry still had over 20 children, but none of them counted. Not officially. The crown had no interest in bastards. No matter how well-educated, charming, or genetically similar they might be. He tried to fix it by naming his legitimate daughter, Empress Matilda, as heir. But when Henry died, the nobles weren't thrilled about the idea of a woman ruling them, so they picked his nephew Stephen instead. And England descended into a long, exhausting civil war. It's one of history's many small ironies. Henry's countless illegitimate sons could have filled every castle in England, and many of them did. But when it came to producing one legitimate heir, he failed spectacularly. Some of those bastard children went on to live extraordinary lives, though Robert of Gloucester, Henry's eldest illegitimate son, became one of the most powerful men in England. He was intelligent, loyal, and just ambitious enough to be useful without being dangerous. He fought for his half-sister Matilda during the Civil War, keeping her claim alive when half the nobility wanted her gone, and it's thanks to him, at least partly, that the throne eventually passed to Matilda's son, Henry II, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. So, in a quiet way, a royal bastard helped shape the entire course of English history. Not bad for someone who technically shouldn't have existed. Now, not every royal bastard had it that good. Some were tolerated, others ignored, and a few were treated as living scandals. Let's drift over to France for a moment, to the glittering, perfume-soaked court of the Valois kings, where illegitimacy was both a moral sin and a fashion statement. Charles VI of France, known unflatteringly as Charles the Mad, had several illegitimate children. This was somewhat awkward, because he also spent much of his reign believing he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. His mistresses handled the situation with remarkable discretion, mostly by pretending not to exist, His legitimate queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, handled it with less grace, developing a reputation for having affairs of her own, whether deserved or not. Their court became a soap opera written by chroniclers who couldn't quite believe their luck, and their children, both legitimate and otherwise, inherited the resulting chaos. A few of the royal bastards were quietly married off to lesser nobles. Others joined the church, where no one could ask too many awkward questions. By the 15th century, French kings had perfected the art of managing their unofficial offspring. They acknowledged them publicly, but only after making sure their legitimate heirs were firmly in place. And sometimes they made them useful. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, took this to an art form. He had numerous illegitimate children, and he loved them, adored them even. He gave them titles, wealth, and lavish marriages, because when you rule by divine right, you can afford to treat your family tree like an optional guideline. His Children by Madame de Montespan, the most famous of his many mistresses, became known as les enfants du roi, the king's children. And Louis didn't just acknowledge them. He legitimized several, granting them noble rank and arranging their lives like pieces on a royal chessboard. Of course, this annoyed the legitimate princes, who were already touchy about inheritance, but Louis XIV was used to people being annoyed at him. It was one of his many talents. Still, even a legitimized bastard could only go so far. They were permitted to shine, but never outshine. They could hold titles, lead armies, even marry well. But they could never inherit the throne. That line was clear, and for many, painfully so. England, ever eager to make things more dramatic than necessary, handled its royal bastards with its own flair for contradiction. Henry, 80, a man who never met a contradiction. He didn't, fathered several illegitimate children. The only one he acknowledged was Henry Fitzroy, whose name literally means son of the king. He was given a dukedom, palaces, tutors, and an education fit for a prince. Henry VIII adored him, possibly more than his legitimate daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had the misfortune of being born female and therefore, in his view, slightly disappointing. There were whispers that Henry might even legitimize Fitzroy and make him heir. But the boy died at 17 from tuberculosis, leaving behind the same sense of unfinished tragedy that haunted most Tudor family matters. If Fitzroy had lived, England's future might have looked very different. Perhaps calmer, perhaps not. It's hard to say with the Tudors. And then there's the other Henry, Henry II, several centuries earlier, whose affair with Rosamund Clifford became the stuff of legend. She was called Fair Rosamund, and by all accounts, she lived up to the title. Their romance was public enough that everyone knew, including his formidable wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was not known for her forgiving nature. Rosamund and Henry had 2 sons together. One became a knight, the other a monk. Both were recognized by their father but barred from royal succession. They drifted quietly into history, footnotes in the grand drama of Plantagenet politics. Rosamond herself met an end so shrouded in myth that historians still argue about it. One story claims Eleanor poisoned her in a fit of jealous rage. Another says she retired peacefully to a convent. The truth, as usual, is probably duller, but no less sad. In all these stories, you start to see a pattern. Royal bastards lived in a strange twilight world. Privileged, yet precarious. They could dine at the king's table one day, and be banished the next. Their worth depended entirely on their father's favor, and royal favor was notoriously fragile. A new queen, a new heir, or a change in political mood could erase them overnight. Some prospered for decades, only to be quietly written out of history by the next generation. Because legitimacy wasn't just about birth, it was about narrative. Who got remembered, and how? And most bastards, no matter how loved or accomplished, didn't make the official cut. Still, the fascination with royal illegitimacy never really went away, even in later centuries. When Europe's monarchies tried to project moral respectability, there were always whispers. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Romanovs, all had their scandals tucked discreetly behind velvet curtains. Illegitimate children became courtiers, generals, even founders of noble families in their own right. They lived in a delicate balance, close enough to power to touch it, but never quite hold it. And in that, they represent something almost poetic, the endless human desire to belong, even when the world insists you shouldn't. Loved in private, forgotten in public, and forever suspended between two worlds. The gentleman who couldn't, and then couldn't anymore. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. One that most people prefer not to picture too vividly before bed, but, well, that's what we're here for. So, settle in. Dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little tighter, and let's talk about eunuchs. Now, if you're like most people, the word alone probably sends your mind running in several directions, most of them uncomfortable. Images of imperial courts, whispering corridors, strange rituals, and one very crucial absence. But there's a quieter question we almost never ask. What happened to these men after the music stopped? After the emperors they served died? After their voices cracked in that peculiar upward way and their usefulness faded? Did they just keep working until they dropped? Did they retire with honors? Or did they, like so many historical figures, simply vanish into the footnotes? Tonight, we'll drift through that mystery. Through the afterlives of the men who were neither quite noble, nor quite servant, neither fully inside the palace, nor ever allowed out of it, because eunuchs were, in a strange way, the ultimate liminal beings, half trusted, half despised, and never quite belonging anywhere, which makes their retirements, when they were suddenly expected to belong nowhere at all, a little tragic, a little absurd, and, of course, entirely human. A life built around other people's power to understand how a eunuch ended, We first need to understand how he began. The idea of castration as a career move feels, understandably, alien to modern ears. But in the pre-modern world, the logic was disturbingly tidy. If you remove a man's ability to have children, you also remove the primary source of dynastic threat. A eunuch could never found a rival line. He could never marry into power. He could never pass on land, titles, or secrets to a son. And so, for rulers across the ancient and medieval worlds, from the Byzantine emperors to the caliphs of Baghdad, from the Tang court in China to the Ottoman sultans, eunuchs were the perfect administrative tool, trustworthy, dependent, and, crucially, unable to create new problems through reproduction. But of course, this supposed trust came with its own irony, because while they were too politically harmless to fear, they were also too unnatural to truly respect. Many rulers relied on eunuchs the way modern CEOs rely on their assistants, intimately, daily, and without ever really remembering they were human beings. The Byzantine edition. Bureaucrats in silk slippers. Let's begin in Byzantium, because of course we will. No civilization loved paperwork, candles, and ceremonial eunuchs more than the Byzantine Empire. In Constantinople, the highest offices in the palace bureaucracy were often staffed almost entirely by eunuchs. They organized coronations, guarded the imperial bedchamber, counted the tax receipts, and occasionally arranged the emperor's assassination. It was a flexible job description. The most famous of them, men like Basil, the Parakoimomenos, or Narses the general, accumulated more power than most dukes or bishops. They commanded armies, directed diplomacy, and managed empresses' wardrobes with equal ease. But what happened when they grew old? Well, that depended on how well they'd played the game. Some retired comfortably into monasteries, where their voices, permanently high, permanently strange, were mistaken for angelic devotion. Others simply stayed on until they physically couldn't. After all, it's hard to retire from a position that's more about proximity to power than salary. Many eunuchs, in fact, simply faded from the record. One day they're in charge of the emperor's treasury. The next, gone, replaced by another smooth-faced official with an equally untraceable past. The empire's bureaucracy was a machine that consumed eunuchs as silently as it did parchment. And yet, some of them carved out surprising afterlives. Take Narses, for example, an elderly eunuch general under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. He was reportedly in his 70s when he led an army to reconquer Italy. 70. A time when most men were quietly praying for a dry cough and a quick exit, not planning sieges. When he finally returned to Constantinople, there wasn't really a retirement plan waiting for him, so he simply moved into a palace of his own. Rich, respected, and, naturally, slightly feared. He spent his final years surrounded by servants and relics, a living reminder that you could remove certain parts of a man, but ambition was not one of them. The other option, monastic life for many eunuchs, though the gentlest ending came not in luxury, but in the cloister. Byzantine monasteries were, oddly enough, one of the few social spaces where eunuchs could exist without scandal. They weren't supposed to marry, which was convenient. They were supposed to renounce the flesh, which, again, was already handled. In fact, some theologians even argued that eunuchs were closer to angels than ordinary men, a convenient way to turn tragedy into theology. So, in their later years, many court eunuchs would donate their fortunes, often considerable ones, to a monastery, in exchange for a quiet cell, warm soup, and a lifetime of chanting. Their voices, still thin and high, made them excellent choir members. Their bureaucratic experience made them terrifying treasurers, and their social invisibility made them ideal confessors. After all, what could you possibly confess that would shock a man who'd seen a Byzantine coronation? Still, it's hard to shake the irony. A life spent serving emperors ended in serving God, but the shape of obedience barely changed. The titles shifted, the robes darkened, but the posture remained. Head bowed, duties endless. Drifting east, the Islamic courts, meanwhile, further east, the Abbasid Caliphate had perfected the art of eunuch employment. In Baghdad's palaces, eunuchs managed harems, trained young princes, and guarded the women's quarters, a role considered both essential and morally safe, because, theoretically, nothing could happen. In practice, of course, the lines were blurrier. Eunuchs often became confidants, even lovers, of their masters. Some were gifted estates, others slaves of their own. And when they grew old, the empire faced the same awkward question. What do you do with a retired eunuch? The answer, again, was bureaucracy or religion. If they were wealthy, they became patrons of mosques. If not, they were pensioned off quietly, usually with a modest house and a promise not to cause trouble. Many chose pilgrimage, a spiritual journey that doubled conveniently as a graceful exit. Once you've walked to Mecca, no one expects you to come back and request a desk job. There's something oddly peaceful about that. The idea of ending a life of service by simply walking out into the desert, leaving behind the marble courtyards and the gossip, and vanishing into the sand. China's imperial eunuchs, the professionals, of course. The true professionals in the eunuch business were the Chinese. Where Byzantium flirted with the idea, China industrialized it. By the Ming dynasty, the Forbidden City housed several thousand eunuchs at a time. Men, responsible for everything, from cooking rice to running the secret police. They were organized into departments with poetic names like the Palace of Pure Enjoyment and the Directorate of Ceremonies, which sounds peaceful until you remember it also included a torture division. At the height of the system, eunuchs were essentially a parallel government. Some, like the infamous Wei Zhongxian, became so powerful they issued decrees under their own names. And yet, even the most powerful eunuch had no lineage. No heirs, no family name to pass on. When they died or retired, their estates reverted to the state. That made their twilight years surprisingly lonely. we have records of retired eunuchs building private gardens filled with artificial children, rows of porcelain dolls dressed as scholars, merchants, or soldiers. A heartbreaking attempt at something like family. Others commissioned elaborate tombs featuring carvings of offspring they never had, or left donations to schools for the sons of others. It was a life that never stopped circling around what had been taken from them. The Ottoman solution, the Ottomans, ever practical, took a different approach. In Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, the chief black eunuch, known as the Kizlar Aga, was one of the most powerful men in the empire. He oversaw the imperial harem, managed vast charitable endowments, and often influenced succession politics. But even he had an expiration date. Upon retirement, the Kizlar Aga was traditionally given a grand house near the Blue Mosque, a stipend, and, because the Ottomans loved poetic symmetry, appointed guardian of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So, yes, a man whose job had been to guard women he could never touch was rewarded by guarding cities he could never own. There's a quiet poetry to that. Still, many retired eunuchs in the empire didn't fare as well. Those without high rank often drifted into managing bathhouses or small shrines, lingering figures in Istanbul's side streets, half respected, half pitied. Visitors described them as men without shadows, always present, but never entirely real. The strange comfort of power. Without legacy, if there's one thread that runs through all these worlds, from Constantinople to Beijing, it's that eunuchs lived lives of paradox. They were powerful, but powerless. And when the palace doors finally closed behind them, they had to learn something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding: how to live without legacy. Modern historians sometimes write about eunuchs as tragic victims, and that's fair. But there's also something quietly philosophical about them. What did medieval widows actually do with their freedom? Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of medieval life. No crusades, no knights galloping into glory, just paperwork, and maybe a little freedom. Because tonight, we're talking about widows. The women left behind when their husbands inevitably marched off to war, caught a fever, or got trampled by a horse named something like Valiant. And as tragic as that sounds, the truth is, for many medieval women, widowhood was the first time in their entire lives that they actually got to breathe. It's one of history's quietest ironies. You spend your youth being married off like a parcel of land, sometimes with a parcel of land. And then, one day, your husband dies, and suddenly you can own property, make contracts, refuse remarriage, and, if you're feeling bold, run your own life. For the first time, no one tells you what to do, unless, of course, the king notices, or your in-laws, or the church, or anyone, really. Because naturally, medieval society didn't handle female independence very well. So, tonight, let's drift gently through that strange, half-free, half-trapped world of the medieval widow. A woman both liberated and limited, pitied and feared, quietly rewriting the rules in a world that kept pretending she couldn't. A slow start to freedom first. Let's set the scene. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly brimming with gender equality. For most women, life went. Born, baptized, married off by age 14, possibly die in childbirth, possibly repeat. But widowhood was a loophole in that script. The moment your husband died, your legal identity, once entirely swallowed by his, snapped back into existence. You could hold property. You could sue or be sued. You could hire servants, write a will, or, quite scandalously, refuse to remarry. In England, a widow even had a special term for her legal allowance. Her dower, a portion of her late husband's estate, meant to support her for the rest of her natural life. Of course, support was a flexible word. Sometimes it meant a comfortable income and a manor. Sometimes it meant a few cows and a damp cottage near the pig yard. It depended largely on whether your husband had been a knight or just someone who worked for one. Still, for the first time, you had something most medieval women never did: autonomy. And people found that deeply unsettling. The widow problem, in the eyes of medieval men, especially lawmakers and priests, widows were complicated. They weren't virgins anymore, which made them suspect. But they weren't under male control either, which made them dangerous. Theologians like to divide widows into two categories. The good kind, who dressed in black, prayed a lot, and quietly withered away in devotion, and the bad kind, who enjoyed their newfound freedom, possibly smiled, and therefore had to be stopped. The Church's ideal widow was basically a nun without the fun. No dancing, no remarriage, no color, no second chances. But reality didn't cooperate, because while medieval Europe was writing moral tracts about virtuous mourning, actual widows were out there buying land, running inns, managing estates, trading wool, and, in some glorious cases, outright refusing to hand over property to their late husband's relatives. If you've ever read legal disputes from the 13th or 14th centuries, they're full of widows calmly suing barons and winning. It's not quite the feminist revolution we might imagine, but it's close enough to irritate every medieval chronicler who ever picked up a quill. Let's talk about money. Let's drift for a moment into the question that everyone, then and now, quietly cared about. How much did a widow actually get? When a husband died, his widow was entitled to her dower, usually 1/3 of his lands and income, for life. She didn't own it outright, but she could collect the rent, harvest the crops, and manage it as she saw fit. And if she was lucky enough to outlive her husband by 20 or 30 years, which many did, that could be a very comfortable situation indeed. Some widows became rich, powerful, even notorious. Take Alice Perrers, the mistress of King Edward III. She started as a lady-in-waiting, married a wealthy judge, and then, after his timely death, became the king's companion, and one of the richest women in England. When Edward died, Parliament accused her of manipulating him for gold. She was stripped of her wealth, then quietly got most of it back, because she understood the system better than anyone, Alice wasn't the rule, but she wasn't an exception either. Across Europe, widows became estate managers, merchants, or landlords, often running operations larger than their late husbands ever did. You could call it grief management through economic expansion. Royal widows, privilege with a side of misery. Of course, royal widows were a special case. When kings died, their widows didn't get cozy dower cottages. They got palaces, and sometimes entire towns. But freedom? Not so much. Most royal widows were pawns on the chessboard of diplomacy. Their remarriages could form or break alliances, so naturally, everyone wanted to control them. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most famous widow in medieval Europe. She married King Louis VII of France, divorced him, and married Henry II of England within 8 weeks. A bold move, and a political earthquake. Eleanor spent much of her life under house arrest for encouraging her sons to rebel against Henry. But after his death, she flourished. In her 70s, she ran the Angevin Empire, negotiated royal marriages, and generally behaved as though the entire concept of old age was beneath her. It turns out that Eleanor's most powerful years were the ones after she became a widow, and she wasn't. Alone, Queen Margaret of Anjou, widowed by the death of Henry VI, spent her remaining years negotiating ransoms, plotting returns to power, and occasionally wandering around France in a very dramatic state of exile. Meanwhile, Isabella of France, sometimes called the she-wolf of France, which is always a promising start, became regent after her husband. Edward II was deposed. She'd helped arrange his overthrow, which made her widowhood slightly complicated. Still, she ruled for several years with quiet authority, before her own son forced her into retirement. A pattern emerges. Even when surrounded by men who wanted to control them, royal widows often ended up doing quite the opposite. The widow's wardrobe now. Let's talk about the fashion of grief. Because even in mourning, medieval Europe loved a good dress code. Widows were expected to wear black or dark gray, symbolic of chastity and loss. Their veils grew longer, their jewelry fewer, and their smiles practically illegal. In some courts, widows were required to wear mourning clothes for a full year before they were even allowed to appear in public again. But mourning could also become performative. A wealthy widow in her late 20s, draped in black silk and lace, could look both pious and mysteriously appealing. Chroniclers often warned that some women used mourning to entice the living by weeping for the dead, which, you have to admit, sounds like a line straight out of medieval gossip columns. Widowhood had its own social currency, the tragic, untouchable beauty who might remarry, but probably shouldn't, and some widows absolutely leaned into it. Remarriage, to wed, or not to wed, the church encouraged widows to stay single. Something about piety and purity, and not enjoying yourself. But remarriage was both common and practical. If you had children to raise, or lands to protect, marrying again could secure allies, protection, and more income. Still, remarriage came with risks. Legally, once you married again, your new husband controlled everything you owned. So, if your first marriage had been mildly suffocating, the second might feel like jumping back into the same coffin. Many widows chose to remain single for precisely that reason, and when men complained, which they did, the women simply cited the Church's own teachings about virtue in widowhood. It's a rare example of medieval theology accidentally giving women leverage. One famous case from 14th century England tells of Agnes Paston, who flatly refused to remarry despite considerable pressure. She wrote that she would not lose her liberty for all the gold in Christendom. A bold sentiment, though she probably still had to pay taxes on that liberty. The Church tries to help, and fails. Monks and preachers loved to lecture widows. There are entire sermons preserved in Latin that begin with, "A widow must be humble, silent, and devoted," and then continue for 20 pages about how awful it would be if she wasn't. But despite these warnings, widows kept doing exactly what they wanted. In Florence, records show widows running textile workshops. In Paris, they managed taverns and bakeries. In York, they traded wool, fish, and wine, all while signing contracts and hiring apprentices. The medieval widow was often less an object of pity and more a quiet powerhouse. And it's that quiet part that's fascinating. They weren't marching or preaching or demanding rights. They were just living efficiently, running things, filling the gaps that men's deaths left behind, and doing it so smoothly that the chroniclers barely noticed, which, in a way, is its own form of rebellion. The fear of the merry widow. Of course, not all widows were discreet. Some enjoyed their freedom so openly that they became moral cautionary tales. The so-called merry widow appears again and again in medieval literature. A woman who smiles too much, dresses too well, and possibly enjoys life again, which made her an affront to the established order. How did people hide their diseases before modern medicine? A little rouge for the pox. Tonight, we're drifting back to a softer, smellier time, a time before antibiotics, before germ theory, before the concept of washing your hands after touching a corpse was universally accepted. Before anyone knew what a virus was, people still had reputations to maintain, and nothing, not even oozing sores, suspicious rashes, or a lingering cough that sounded like the gates of hell creaking open, was allowed to get in the way of looking respectable. So tonight, we'll be gliding gently through history's quieter medical cover-ups, the powders, wigs, wines, and whispered excuses that people used to pretend everything was perfectly fine, while everything was, in fact, quite the opposite. We'll see queens who covered their smallpox scars with makeup so thick it could stop an arrow. We'll meet courtiers who literally perfumed their breath to disguise tuberculosis, and we'll wander through a few centuries of people convincing themselves that mercury was medicinal, that bleeding made you better, and that nobody would notice the missing bits of your face if you just kept smiling. So, pull the blanket up, and let's drift back to the days when looking healthy meant lying convincingly. Torn. The royal art of pretending to be fine. Let's begin with a scene from 17th century England, a period when the average aristocrat's skincare routine was somewhere between chemical warfare and performance art. Meet Queen Elizabeth I, the original influencer of strategic concealment. When Elizabeth contracted smallpox in 1562, she survived, which was impressive given the time, but her face did not. The illness left her with pockmarks and scars, and in a court obsessed with appearances, that was a social catastrophe. So, she did what every sensible monarch would do. She invented the Tudor face filter. Elizabeth's courtiers began applying layer after layer of white lead and vinegar paste, called Venetian ceruse, across her skin. It was a deadly mixture, quite literally toxic, that gave her that signature porcelain glow. The more her face peeled and blistered, the more paint she applied to hide it. It was like using fire to cover smoke. And of course, because she was the queen, everyone copied her. Soon the English court was full of people quietly poisoning themselves to appear healthy, in a world where actual health was, frankly, unattainable. As one contemporary wrote, "Her Majesty did glisten as marble, but her countenance was as that of one entombed," a poetic way of saying she looked fabulous, and faintly deceased. Perfumed plague's disease wasn't just visible, it was smellable. Before modern medicine, people thought bad air, miasma, caused illness. So if you stank, you were both diseased and contagious. The solution? Cover the smell. In 17th century France, courtiers bathed roughly once per season. That's not an exaggeration. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, and each one an event. In between, they relied on perfume. And by perfume, we mean weapons-grade scent camouflage. Louis XIV's court at Versailles was notorious for its odors. The palace had no proper plumbing, the courtiers had no shame, and the combination was potent. But image was everything. So, the aristocracy developed an entire culture of olfactory illusion, spritzing themselves, their wigs, their gloves, and occasionally their small dogs with musky florals, strong enough to paralyze a peasant at 10 paces. Perfume wasn't just for vanity. It was a defense mechanism. People thought the pleasant smell would drive away disease, masking both the stench of decay and the supposed miasma of contagion. Of course, it didn't work, but everyone smelled expensive as they died. Cosmetic engineering for the chronically unwell. Let's drift to the 18th century now, the Age of Enlightenment, or as I like to call it, the age of cosmetics doing all the heavy lifting. Medicine hadn't really improved, but mirrors had, and that meant people were now fully aware of what they looked like while dying slowly of syphilis. Syphilis, known variously as the French disease, the Neapolitan disease, and that thing sailors brought back, was the great social equalizer. It touched popes, poets, and prostitutes alike. It also ate away the face, which, naturally, was a bit of a problem for those trying to maintain dignity in the salon. The wealthy solved this through cosmetic prosthetics, small wax or leather pieces that could be glued onto the face to replace missing noses, lips, or chins. They were often painted and perfumed, sometimes even attached with little metal hinges. Think of it as early 3D printing, but horrifying, and because silence was politeness, nobody mentioned it. You could sit across from a duke whose nose was, quite literally, detachable, and still be expected to discuss poetry over tea as if nothing was amiss. One French physician, writing in the 1720s, described a patient who lost the greater part of his visage, yet appeared daily at court, most elegantly repaired. Wigs, powder, and other medical accessories. While we're in the 18th century, we can't ignore the other great concealment industry: wigs. Wigs were originally a practical cover for hair loss caused by syphilis and lice, but quickly became a fashion statement. After all, if everyone's bald, it's not a problem. The French king Louis XVIII started the trend out of necessity. By his 20s, he'd gone bald. His son, Louis XIV, doubled down and made wigs a royal uniform. By the time of Louis XV, it was impossible to tell whether anyone in the French court still had a natural hairline, or even a scalp worth showing. Beneath the powder and curls there were sores, rashes, and infestations aplenty. But what mattered was the illusion: powdered health, perfumed grace, and a steady gaze that said, "I am fine, thank you," while every organ quietly gave up. In a way, the wig became the perfect metaphor for pre-modern health culture. An elaborate lie, so widely agreed upon that it became the truth. Mercury, the great equalizer, of course. Some diseases were too dramatic to be hidden with wigs and rouge. For those, medicine stepped in. Or at least, what passed for medicine, and nothing says we had no idea what we were doing like mercury. For centuries, mercury was the go-to treatment for syphilis. It came in ointments, vapors, and drinks. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, they used to say, though not as a warning, as medical advice. It did something, to be fair. It made people sweat, salivate, and lose their teeth, which doctors took as signs the body was purging illness. In reality, they were just poisoning themselves to death. But stylishly so. To hide the side effects, sufferers caked on more makeup, wore thicker wigs, and used scented handkerchiefs to catch the drool. A famous portrait of Charles II's mistress, Barbara Palmer, shows her with slightly puffy cheeks and pale skin. Likely not vanity, but mercury damage disguised as elegance. It's oddly poetic. They were dying beautifully, one fashionable symptom at a time. The social side of secrecy, you see, before modern privacy laws or medical ethics. Disease wasn't just a health problem, it was a moral one. having visible illness meant shame. It implied sin, weakness, or divine punishment, so people lied. Royal physicians falsified reports to protect monarchs. Reputations, courtiers disappeared for the season whenever the gout flared up. And artists quietly retouched. Portraits to erase signs of decline. King Henry VIII, famously ulcerated and probably diabetic, insisted his portraits always depict him as virile and broad-shouldered, even when he could barely walk. In reality, by the end of his life, Henry's leg wounds oozed constantly. His temper was apocalyptic, and his courtiers had to invent elaborate excuses to leave the room before fainting. Yet in official accounts, he remained the image of royal power. The smell, one assumes, was politely ignored. It wasn't just individuals who performed wellness. Whole courts became theaters of denial. At Versailles, when the king had gout, courtiers praised his noble fortitude. When he had dysentery, they said he was detoxifying his humors. When he died, they said, "His Majesty has chosen to rest." Monarchs set the tone, and everyone else followed suit. If the ruler wore makeup to hide illness, so did the nobles. If he denied being sick, they denied noticing. A court could maintain a collective delusion for decades. One of the most astonishing examples comes from the 18th century Holy Roman Empire, where Emperor Charles VI developed what modern scholars suspect was arsenic poisoning. His hair fell out, his skin yellowed, and he became increasingly paranoid. Yet his court continued to praise his radiant vitality in daily bulletins. When he finally died, the official announcement declared that His Majesty has ascended to glory in perfect health, which was true in a theological sense. And so, when the towns grew quiet, when the bells ceased and the crowds dispersed, he remained, sharpening his tools, mixing salves, or sitting by a dim candle, waiting for the next summons, because there would always be another crime, another judgment, another day's work. But in between those moments of spectacle and blood, the executioner's world was one of stillness. Routine,